Yeah, I was just going to say, speaking of peace talks and concessions, why don't we shift over to talking about more of Trump's announcements for his picks? And we can start right at the top with retired General Keith Kellogg, who's being tapped to be the Ukrainian envoy for peace talks. So, what do we know about this guy, fellas?
Fox News and CNN contributor, former national security advisor to Vice President Mike Pence. Yeah, great resume so far. Not to bash him too hard for that, but I read his paper that he authored with let's see, what was his co-author? Fred Fleets. I'm not sure what his rank is, if he has one, but Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleets drafted a paper April 29th, 2024. America First, Russia and Ukraine. So there's a large document explaining this guy's plan for how the war would end. And I hate to say it, but to me, it looks like the plan, if this guy represents the Trump administration's genuine plan, the plan is to do exactly what we're doing, but call it America First. So basically, just rebrand what we're doing as slop to feed Trump's base, so that it feels like we're winning, even though it's the exact same thing. I don't know if anyone else got a chance to read the documents. I kind of took point on researching this guy, but yeah, this to me looks like a dismal pick that basically just says we're going to do what we're already doing, but just call it America First instead. And there you go, which means it's not going to work. And this is why I've been consistently saying for the past couple of weeks that I don't believe that the Trump administration is going to be able to negotiate an end to this war. It'll probably last at least until 2026 because it seems to me that no one uh, dealing with this issue understands the fundamentals of why this conflict's even happening, especially the fact that Tucker Carlson doesn't really seems to be kind of sidelined in the positioning here. We'll get to that perhaps when we read some excerpts from this guy's paper, which we have queued up.
Well, I mean, this is kind of a side note, but it has to do with Trump's picks. It seems like the Trump administration is being hamstrung before it even gets into power by none other than the GOP. A lot of people that he could potentially have picked would have already, for his appointments, would have already been just, dead on arrival, as we saw with Gates and as it's shaping up with Hegseth. It's a good time to remind everybody the GOP is the enemy. The conservatives and the neocons, to the extent that they still exist, and the progressives on the quote unquote Republican Party are the enemy. And don't let your normicon relatives forget it.
I just looked at how old this Kellogg guy is.
Yeah, he's 80. He's 80. So
oh my god,
great,
perfect
pay.
Oh, can we please get somebody new? Can we please have some fresh blood in there?
Yeah, 80-year-old Vietnam vet. I read some articles swooning over him that says he's just the right man to deal with Putin. So that's how you know that this is a great pick.
Yeah,
you pick this Vietnam boomer. Anyway, we have on screen some of the excerpt. I will actually just read it out loud. So, the America First approach also requires a strong military, the prudent use of U.S. military force, and keeping U.S. troops out of unnecessary and unending wars. It means working in alliances and with partners to promote regional security while requiring alliance members and allies to carry full weight in defending security in the region. Based on these principles, we believe the tragic failures of the Ukraine war exemplify why the America First approach to U.S. national security better addresses the challenges this type of conflict poses to U.S. national interest and how it could have been prevented. Most importantly, the America First approach to national security provides guidelines on how this war can be brought to an end. So all that paragraph really says is that we're going to make the European countries pay more for NATO, kind of like Trump was doing last time. There's not really any other content there.
I mean, cute, but we don't want to be involved in the conflict at all, period. So regardless of, the Europeans get to pay a little bit more. It's like, okay, that's great, but that doesn't actually solve the underlying issue.
No. And
Exactly.
so, yeah. Continuing on another paragraph, during the Trump administration, the United States no longer tolerated Russia's repeated nuclear treaty violations and withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty. So we see the results of that a few days ago, right? The Oreshnik missile test, the intermediate range nuclear missile, or not nuclear missile in that case, but you understand what I mean. It's nuclear capable. The Trump administration also began the process of withdrawing from the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty with Russia in hopes of negotiating a stronger and more effective treaty that would also include China's nuclear arsenal. So this is a problem because what's being kind of celebrated here as a win by like getting out of these treaties that Russia allegedly wasn't agreeing to. What did that do other than now they have been developing the type of weapons we saw demonstrated the other day? This is a very bad move on Trump's part in his first administration, withdrawing from these treaties, because all you've really done is reactivate some of the key problems of the Cold War, which is the development of nuclear missiles and missile defense. I mean, this is just if this is like something that he thinks is good, that's a really bad sign, because these treaties exist for a reason, and they shouldn't just be pulled out of unilaterally, especially when, unlike the Russian Federation, the United States has no coherent long-term military strategy, as we see demonstrated with the American failure to support Ukraine over the last 2 years. So once again, yeah, that's really bad. Moving on, just the immediate paragraph after that. On Ukraine, the Trump administration promoted a strong deterrent approach by authorizing the first ever lethal military aid package to Ukraine, equipping its armed forces with advanced Javelin anti-armor missiles, naval vessels, and Mark 6 patrol boats. This was a major break from the Obama administration, which agreed only to provide non-lethal military assistance, despite passionate appeals by Ukrainian officials for U.S. arms to fight pro-Russian separatist rebels in the Donbass. President Obama refused to send weapons to Ukraine because he feared it would provoke Putin. President Trump disagreed and sent weapons to Ukraine as a sign of American strength and support for a friendly state. So all I'm reading there is that the war is Trump's fault because Trump is the guy who provoked Putin by sending all these weapons to Ukraine and basically started putting NATO in Ukraine, which is exactly what the Russians didn't want. So once again, this is implying to me that fundamentally the incoming administration simply does not understand the nature of this conflict, like, at all. Just, this is truly dismal stuff. And people will know I've been covering this conflict pretty much nonstop. Not doing live streams nonstop, but I've been paying attention to it nonstop for the 2.5 years it's been going on now. So anyway, we have some more. Any comments before I continue on? I get.
No, just that I'm missing Henry Kissinger or a caliber character like him. I'm just so sick and tired of these octogenarian fucks in charge.
Yeah, we are all longing for serious statesmen.
Yeah, the fact that this guy's 80, it's like, dude, really? It's like, it's.
I think the most interesting thing from the Trump-Rogan interview was him discussing bringing in people on his team, and he said that some of his biggest mistakes were bringing on private sector people who weren't DC swamp types. And he made a good point that you've been vetted over and over again in DC, whether you know it or not, by the intelligence agencies and this and that. But if you bring in a private sector guy, they have all sorts of international entanglements. So I think that's a huge reason why you just see a lot of more of the same in terms of the swamp people coming into the administration. I don't know if he will be as hamstrung as the first term, but like Charlie said, it's not looking good.
Yeah, this is an atrocious pick for the age reason. I mean, Trump is 78. He is one of the few exceptions that he gets a pass basically because he is Trump. That's the reason why people overlook his age in the electoral system and why people don't care about that issue. But it seems that he is making the mistake of applying that logic to other figures, and that's just not acceptable from my point of view.
No, this really looks phenomenally bad. So I will continue here. This bit's just kind of interesting. In May 2021, 9 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration waived U.S. sanctions on the construction of the Russian Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a decision that garnered bipartisan opposition. Biden officials claimed at the time that the reason for this decision was to mend U.S. relations with Germany, which they alleged were strained over Trump administration policies, such as challenging Germany's reliance on Russian energy and its failure to meet its NATO defense spending contributions. I mean, it's interesting because what we see now is that, well, the reason the Biden administration authorized that is because they knew they would just blow it up later if they, felt like there was a need to do that. So I just thought that was worth pointing out. This is a part I alluded to earlier. So continuing on, during a February 2024 interview with Putin by journalist Tucker Carlson, Putin provided a long, nonsensical account of Russian and Ukrainian history in which he disputed Ukraine's nationality and history and repeated his ridiculous claims that Russia invaded Ukraine in part to fight Nazism in the country. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I remember he barely talked about the Nazism part in that interview, number one. And number two, just talking about disputing Ukraine's nationality. The country's not even been on the map for 30 fucking years. Like this is just stupid. I mean, I'm like very basic bitch knowledge of this topic, basically from watching your coverage on this, Charlie, the last couple of years. And how's it that I have a better understanding of Russia's objectives than these fucking people?
Furthermore, it doesn't make sense either, given the Ukrainian government's official usage of a neo-Nazi formation, Azov Battalion, in their military. So you can't say that, oh, well, they're not, it's not happening, right? Oh, like it's not happening. Oh, but it is happening. Oh, but they were taken off the official roster. Like whatever. They're still part of the Ukrainian military. They're still part of the Ukrainian armed forces.
These idiot like 80-year-old boomers just seem to forget like the internet exists, and we have pictures of all these people that they think they could just lie on all these official documents now, and nobody could fact check them. Nobody could see things that are actually happening on the front lines. They don't think anybody has iPhones. There aren't independent journalists like Tucker going around talking to people. When this guy could just say, oh, well, Putin said this in this interview, and this is a complete nonsensical historical conception of Ukraine's sovereignty, when like Putin listed off 1,000 years of Russian history during that interview. I mean, this guy probably can't remember what he had for breakfast yesterday.
I mean, part of it is that these people aren't talking to us; they're talking to each other. They exist in an echo chamber that is siloed off from the rest of the world. That, I mean, they believe that because it comes from the intelligence agencies, that it's the best information that can be garnered. So, like, if the intelligence agencies, say, but in some crazy upside down world, started hiring for DEI, or were lying to the members of Congress or the people in the government, then all these people would know is horseshit. So it's not even necessarily that they're lying to our faces. They could just be completely fucking ignorant because they're not actually in charge of anything.
I mean, that's just another reason why we shouldn't have 80-year-old cabinet picks. Sorry.
Just by the day, Vox Day's take of the day of the pillow needs to come like faster and faster. It's so fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's good you mentioned the Lavrov interview again, because this is something Lavrov touches on. What this guy and what people don't understand is that when the Russians talk about Nazis, what they mean is people who want to ethnically cleanse and kill Russians. And there was plenty of that, as Lavrov referenced in the interview with Tucker. Go watch it. There's plenty of that going on in Ukraine before the war and during the war. And that's what the Russians mean when they talk about Nazis. They're not talking about literal, like, resurrected Waffen SS or something like that. But of course, these people don't understand that because they don't read any books. And they have no idea. They don't know the slightest thing about what the Russian people actually think about any of this. And just the fact that he doesn't diss Tucker there, but he basically claims that, like, what Putin said was nonsensical. And of course, it was sensical. You don't have to agree with it, but it was sensical. But the fact that he's completely dismissing the contents of that interview indicates to me not just an ignorance, but a refusal to understand the Russian perspective, which if you don't do that, you can't possibly negotiate with them in a productive way. It's just a complete waste of time.
Well, carry on
So
to
we
this
have some
last
more.
one here.
Yes. For example, since the beginning of the conflict, the U.S. has sent over 2,000 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. Yet, at the current rate of production, it will take the United States 13 years to backfill and replenish this munitions stockpile. The U.S. has also sent Ukraine more than 2 million 155 millimeter artillery rounds, but the U.S. currently produces only 14,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition per month. The Pentagon has noted that 14,000 rounds are often depleted by the Ukrainian army within 48 hours of direct fighting between Ukrainians and Russians. So, that's just sort of pointing out the complete lack of leverage that the Trump administration has, because we can only produce as many rounds in a month as the Ukrainians use in 2 days. And that's not going to even remotely change until 2026. So, where is the leverage that this guy intends to bring and that Trump claims he can bring upon the Russians? Elsewhere in this paper, I didn't cite it, but he talks about.
Let me stop you there, Charlie. So
Yeah.
that's a pre-war figure for the audience's information. The one factory that produced this stuff was brought up to full capacity shortly after the conflict began, and that was basically doubled that production from that one single factory to 28,000 shells of 155 millimeter. That's per month production. So that 14,000 number is a little dated. The number is now 28,000. And as you mentioned, the factories have to get spun up for this thing, and that the number for full production of in other words, they're building 2 additional factories. So 28,000 times by 3, you do the math. That's what it'll be in 2026. But that hasn't happened yet.
That's interesting because this was, written in April. So the fact that he fails to even cite the actual production rate that the U.S. currently has by a factor of 2 is pretty fucking dismal. There's even a footnote on that number. So yeah, but either way, the point stands. I think you'll agree that the U.S. doesn't have the leverage it needs anywhere in the near future to actually force the Russians to come to the negotiating table. And then I have one last section highlighted here, and then we'll be done with this. Specifically, and this is talking about the conclusion, specifically, it would mean a formal U.S. policy to seek a ceasefire and negotiated settlement on the Ukraine conflict. The United States would continue to arm Ukraine and strengthen its defenses to ensure Russia will make no further advances and will not attack again after a ceasefire or peace agreement. Future American military aid, however, will require Ukraine to participate in peace talks with Russia. So before I read the next paragraph, I'll just say that just sounds like exactly what we're doing now. That's just all what we're doing now. We're just going to give them more stuff. Of course, the Ukrainians are going to agree to negotiate. We already see Zelensky doing that. So it's really all going to be on the Russians to negotiate or not. So basically, all he's saying is we're just going to give even more to Ukraine. Continuing, to convince Putin to join peace talks, President Biden and other NATO leaders should offer to put off NATO membership for Ukraine. And remember, this is April 2024. That's what he's talking about, Biden. For an extended period of time, should offer to put off NATO membership for Ukraine for an extended period of time in exchange for a comprehensive and verifiable peace deal with security guarantees. In their April 2023 Foreign Affairs article, Richard Haas and Charles Kupchan proposed that in exchange for abiding by a ceasefire, a demilitarized zone, and participating in peace talks, Russia could be offered some limited sanctions relief. Ukraine would not be asked to relinquish the goal of regaining all its territory, but it would agree to use diplomacy, not force, with the understanding that this would require a future diplomatic breakthrough, which probably will not occur before Putin leaves office. Until that happens, the United States and its allies would pledge to only fully lift sanctions against Russia and normalize relations after it signs a peace agreement acceptable to Ukraine. We also call for placing levies on Russian energy sales to pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. So, what is he offering there? The only carrot is limited sanctions relief, which doesn't matter at all, because if you read my previous paid article, for example, on my own Substack, even the people behind these sanctions recognize that they don't really work against a great power. So there's nothing being offered to the Russians here, and it's also, again, the position is total defeat of the Russians, because all he said is a ceasefire, and eventually the Russians will come to some later diplomatic settlement where they leave. So there's no possibility of the Russian annexations being internationally recognized, which is what they would need, right? So there's absolutely nothing in what I just read that differs in any way from what the regime is currently doing in terms of the actual substantive effects on the war.
Right. It just looks like, I mean, if you wanted to bring Russia to the peace table, you'd have to offer them like something really substantive, which is no NATO membership for Ukraine, no demilitarization zone, no NATO troops in Ukraine, even as peacekeepers, formal recognition of the annexed territories in the Donbass and Crimea. I mean, that's your minimum off-ramp at this point, and that's guaranteed by Russian arms. So, like, it's been you've proven that Ukraine cannot recapture that territory now. So what now?
Yes,
Like,
and also Syria's proven that frozen conflicts don't stay frozen. So this idea of a ceasefire and demilitarized zone, that's what existed since 2014. He's just saying we should go back to that status quo. Of course, what guarantees can be offered to the Russians that they actually would count on the West to maintain? It's like he doesn't even mention Minsk. I don't think he mentions the Minsk agreements once in here. Yeah, the word Minsk doesn't even appear once in this entire 19-page document. I mean, this he simply has no idea what he's talking about. This whole idea of NATO membership for Ukraine being put off for an extended period of time, I think Trump mentioned 10, 20 years. That's also impossible, because there's no amount of time that the Russians can have to prepare for that, right? If you've watched, for example, the Operational Art of War, the issue is that Eastern Ukraine is positioned so that any attack on Russia could only be stopped, at least like halted at all, even temporarily, at the gates of Moscow. There's simply no defendable terrain. So there is no time period in which NATO membership for Ukraine, especially with its current borders, is okay. And I'm assuming that this even includes Crimea in in the borders that he wants back as well. So it's just like, this is completely unworkable. It fundamentally understands absolutely nothing about why this war is even happening and what the Russians could realistically wish to get out of a ceasefire. And I mean, right now we're seeing on the front line the Ukrainian army is collapsing in the southern Donetsk front. Like that front has broken down. It's roughly 100-kilometer long front, which is like 60 miles or something. The Russians are just moving kilometers every single day, and there's no indication that the Ukrainians are going to be able to plug that. So the issue is, it's no longer just like a static war where they can just wait forever. If this war is going to continue for a year because of unworkable plans like this, the Russians are eventually just going to decisively defeat the Ukrainian military across the entire front. Right now they've been decisively defeated only in a very small section of the front. Roughly 60 miles. But eventually that problem is going to balloon, and the Russians are just going to take what they want. So it's like, yeah, this is a
Russian industrial capacity has increased impressively during the war as well. There was numbers cited earlier in his statement about ammo production, and I mean, Russia has a self-sufficient economy. I was reading about how they were selling their oil to India, which is actually going to the United States. I mean, you're just increasing the cost on yourself at this point. It's a self-sufficient economy. You can't stop their production.
Yeah, exactly. It's you can't sanction a great power and deter it like you can smaller countries. And I mean, it's true that the Russians are probably at peak tanks right now. If you look at the satellite images of all of their older bases, they have been mostly stripped of functional BMPs, T-72s, T-64s, and whatnot, right? So it is true that the Russians have delved very deeply into their Soviet reserves, and that 2025 and 2026 is probably going to see a decline in the number of tanks being added and other armored vehicles being added to their forces. But that said, what does that really matter? It's like, okay, they're not going to have more of a material advantage in certain respects as they do now, but the material advantage the Russians have is so extreme, like 10-1. It's not going to matter if they peter off slightly over the next 2 years, because the Ukrainians are just going to be attrited that much more.
And all of those assets are Cold War vintage anyway, so Russia can afford to lose them over time because they'd all have to get replaced. They're obsolescent in many cases, and they're simply old. So cost of storage, cost of maintenance, you got to think about that stuff exponentially increases. And if you have a BMP or a T-62 or a T-72 of older vintage get blown up by a drone in Ukraine or run over a mine or whatever, it matters far less because you're going to have to replace that over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, essentially. And that's the same thing for NATO and all the equipment that's being granted from the NATO forces, too. There's a reason why all of the equipment, F-16s included, are all of Cold War era vintage. It's just a way to get rid of this equipment.
Right, exactly. I mean, all of that stuff would be gotten rid of anyway. The U.S. does this. I mean, sometimes you just have to literally melt down, recycle, destroy your older stock if you can't find a use for it. So it's not really hurting the Russian Federation in some fundamental way, because as we've talked about, the experience that the Russian military is getting in fifth generation combat is outweighing any loss of material. The only real loss to the Russians is the fatalities and casualties, but the military experience will carry over, and even that will be outweighed by the looks of it. So, yeah, I know that this was a bit long, but I thought it was worth going kind of in depth on this pick, since this is kind of one of the main things that Trump ran on, is ending this war. And if this pick is indicative of the strategy the administration is going to pursue, this is just hopeless. So something has to change here in what the plan is. And that document was written in April with another author, but looking at more recent articles and stuff, it's just kind of reiterated. This guy was clearly picked and kind of groomed for this position by the America First Policy Institute, which is sort of one of these like pro-Trump think tanks. But like I said, it sounds to me like they're just going to rebrand what we're doing already as America First, and that's just going to be sold to people as some sort of win.
Which lets us know that it is our responsibility not to buy whatever's on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. As we covered many weeks ago, one of the main goals here at the OGC, the things we need to be pushing for the next 4 years, is end to all of these foreign wars. Not, Europeans need to start paying their fair share. Not, we need to have America First agenda of, making sure American equipment is put in the best places abroad to fight on the Ukrainian behalf. No, we want an end to these wars. We shouldn't be involved. We should not be involved in Ukraine from the very start of it. This is completely ridiculous. The idea that they were going to put Ukraine in NATO right on Russia's doorstep is a complete non-starter for the Russians, a nuclear-armed power. And I'm sorry, you don't get to be a tiny-ass little country right next door to a big superpower and start waving your big dick around, demanding independence and, freedom from foreign influence when you're not nuclear-armed. I mean, tough fucking luck. All right? It honestly would be like, Puerto Rico or some shit trying to start something with the United States. It's just dumb right on its face. We shouldn't be involved.
Not to mention the CIA's influence in putting the current Ukrainian regime in power.
That as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
it's like something out of Bugs Bunny, when he just holds up a sign.
We need Doug
Screwball,
to tweet that.
Crackpot.
Doug, send tweet now, Doug.
Screwball, crackpot. I love it.